Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jordanna Gessler, and I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Holocaust Museum LA in Los Angeles, California. I have an incredible honor to moderate this session, convening conversations with communities, with some extraordinary artists, storytellers, leaders, who are really going to speak to us about why it is crucial to have conversations and why museums are the perfect place for those conversations to be taking place. So on today's panel, we have Sarah Pharaon, who's the principal of Dialogue Consulting. We have Annie Polland, who's the president of the Tenement Museum, and we have Adam W. McKinney, who's the artistic director of the Pittsburgh Ballet Theater. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, I'm actually going to invite Adam to come and really demonstrate to us how art has the profound way of moving us, literally and figuratively.
Check. Hello, everybody.
Yes.
Hi. Really good to be with you. Adam McKinney. My nickname is Zeev. My middle name is Zeev, and my nickname is Zeev, and it's really good to be with you. We all have bodies, and we are all inevitably dancers. And while we're here in this moment, as our digestive systems are working, I welcome us to go to our spines, that is our nervous systems, our brain, spine, pelvis. And while we're here, and I hope you can see me, and if you don't, I'm gonna work to use my words. I welcome us to, if you can, take one hand and put it on your chest. And I welcome us to breathe. Keep breathing. And for each wave of breath, I welcome you to lengthen the inhale and then the exhale. Each inhale and exhale gets a little longer. Really good. Keep breathing. And as we take an inhale, I welcome us to arch the back and just look up at the sky. And then as we exhale, curve and look down at the floor, if you would. And again, inhale, arch. Arching the spine, and exhale, curve. Inhale, arch. Exhale, curve. Take that 3 more times. Inhale, arch. Exhale, curve. Inhale, arch. Exhale, curve. And one last time. Inhale, arch. Exhale, curve. Really good. Keep breathing. Pittsburgh Ballet Theater is auditioning dancers, and you just had a really great audition. You'll be hearing from us in the next period of time. Handing it back to Jordanna. Oh, please. You're kind.
Thank you. I would be remiss to moderate a conversation about conversations to not remind everyone that this is a conversation. So while we are speaking today, while we are sharing, I invite all of you to pick up a note card. It can be whatever color you want, and preferably pink. If there's a pink note card on your table, write down your question, write down your thought, write down what you're curious about, write down what you want to have a conversation about, and please get up and bring it to this desk here. You will make my job as a moderator easier if you submit questions and I don't have to ask them. So please do think about doing that because we really want to hear from all of you. When I was thinking about this topic of conversations and how where I work, Holocaust Museum LA has them, I really thought about the core of any conversation, which is the relationship. The relationship you have with yourself, the relationship you have with the person that you're having the conversation with, which could also be yourself, but your peers, your colleagues, networks, strangers, neighbors, your community, other communities. And it made me think of the power of relationships. My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor, and he survived through many different moments of luck or wit or smarts or kindness from other people based on relationships that he had built himself. Now, I'm not going to say that every relationship that he's ever made or I ever made is going to result in a life-saving moment, but out of the thousands, hundreds of relationships and conversations he had with non-Jews, one non-Jewish person stood up and said, "I want to help save your life." And I think that when we are considering what it means to have a conversation, we need to be doing that in moments of calmness, right? When we're trying to engage in these complex, complicated conversations filled with complexities, which are crucial. I don't think that's a question. I don't think you guys think it's a question. Complex conversations are crucial. They help us learn about history, values, identity. They help us sharpen our critical thinking skills, which is really what museums are all about. They move us to consider larger narratives, different narratives, and to have these complex conversations and to hold space for them is a continuous journey. Are there any marathon runners here? Okay, so I'm not. Can you get up and just run a marathon without training? No, he's shaking his head no. Being able to hold complexity and open conversations with people is a muscle, and it is a muscle that needs to be worked over and over and over again. It needs to be worked in different spaces. It needs to be worked in different ways. So some of the incredible work that Holocaust Museum LA has done is over the last decade built relationships with universities, education institutes, religious institutions, advocacy organizations, culturally specific museums, culturally specific groups, mostly in times of calm, in times of preparation, as almost an emergency preparedness for society. And then when the marathon day comes, when the moment comes where there's a trauma, when there's a break, again, not every single relationship is going to show up and say, "I'm going to save you," or "I'm here for you," or "I want to talk to you." But many of them will, and you will not have that without first engaging in these conversations. Now, as a room filled of highly emotionally intelligent people, which I'm guessing because we either work in the museum space or civil servants, and I want to imagine we've all come to this for the right reasons, I think we all know that opening space for others allows opening space for ourselves, and building empathy allows us to build space for the complexities that this world is demanding of us in this moment and in every moment. So if you feel that you are not in a moment of trauma right now, think about who you could reach out to who you've never spoken to. Who can your organization or institution reach out to and start building that relationship? If you are in a moment of trauma right now, when you come out of it, because I promise you will, in that moment think, who can I have a conversation with? Who can I start this narrative with? Because you don't start exercising that muscle when you're at the marathon, you start exercising the muscle way before that. Objects truly have the ability to transmit stories and narratives and learning. And I think we all know that sometimes when there are no words, there is art. And so just serving as a reminder for those of us in the museum space, we are at such an incredible spot. As trusted institutions, yes, of course, but as institutions that hold collections and pieces and objects and art that can transcend socially constructed differences between us, we are at this pivotal moment and can play a pivotal role in convening conversations so that when times of crises do arise, we know who to call upon and we know who will show up for us. So thank you so much for joining and listening to this conversation. I am now going to turn it over to Sarah, who will share a little bit more about her experiences and what has worked during dialogue and difficult conversations.
I first want to say that my intention is really just to give you a frame of how I approach the work, and then also an example of a recent challenging conversation. And then I'm going to stop talking with the hope that we can surface and center and find time for as many conversations and questions as possible. With that in mind, yes, my name is Sarah Pharaon. I now work with a firm called Dialogic Consulting, but the multiple lenses of institutions that I bring into this space span my work as the founding curator of the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, my time as the director of education at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. Hey, Annie. And also my work on a global and international space, working as the program director for North America with the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. All of those institutions have been involved and in discussing and moments within the wake of the incidents in October, as well as talking about issues of anti-Semitism and genocide across decades. Most importantly, however, I come to you in this space as someone who is deeply related to these issues in a personal way as well. My husband is an Arab American. My children very fiercely define themselves as both Arab and Palestinian. And so bringing all of those exposures and experiences into this space is also how I welcome all of you to bring those experiences and exposures into this space as well. And critically, as we think about the conversations that we are uniquely equipped to have and to hold with our audiences, encourage us to examine those spaces in which we can authentically and with ethics and responsibility enter. One of the decisions I made in coming and being a part of the gathering was in a moment where Melissa said, "Are you okay to be there?" Which was a really important question for me to entertain and for all of us to entertain when we think about being facilitators in these spaces. The example that I want to share with you is an example from the Corning Museum of Glass, who many of you would say, is this the right example? And while we were talking about collections, most notably collections in ethnic-centered museums or ethnic identity-focused museums, the collections of exhibitions done by numerous institutions across the United States are ripe for the type of conversations that we are having as well. The folks at the Corning Museum of Glass called me specifically because of the lenses of experience that I was bringing to a conversation that admittedly happened late in their process, as most community engagement sessions do, for an exhibition entitled Dig Deeper. They began to think about, as they prepared for Dig Deeper, what were the things that they wanted to accomplish, and in true museum practice, they used alliteration. And they began to think about how would they bring people together for this exhibition, knowing that the vast majority of pieces of glass that would be on display were uncovered from archaeological work that had been done in Jalame, that many of the artifacts that would be placed would be put in place with labels that said that they were coming from the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and that they were working and living in a community that, much like all of our communities, was trying to figure out how do we talk about ongoing issues of ownership within museums, ownership within communities, and how we build our collections both historically and today. We brought together a group that they termed as community circles. This was a group of folks that were drawn from folks who already had a relationship with the museum. They were folks that met very quickly across the time period of March to early April. It was an interfaith group, all with personal connections to both Israel and/or Palestine. This was a group that represented folks who were in education, folks who identified as religious leaders, folks who identified as material culture experts, science, and neighbors of the institution in and of itself. And it's important to indicate that these were all folks who were local. Because though we as a museum field tend to talk about these as larger national and international conversations, these conversations look very different in the individual communities that we are a part of. The group came together to articulate values, a theme that I've heard at many of the small tables as I've been walking around. What are the actual values that they were seeking to articulate within the exhibition? To review maps and geographic naming, which we know is a challenge coming into any of these spaces. To write a community introduction and statement, a place of ownership and questions that they were positioning the exhibition for all visitors and attendees. And to conduct formative evaluation of select labels that the museum felt might be more challenging, right, coming into the space. And the four circles and the values that I articulate for here are the values that they said. Now, we didn't walk into a space and say, hey, what are the values you want? But we listened to the terms and the words and that they were using, and they came to these. Now, I know for accessibility purposes, these might be a little hard to read from where you are, but they articulated and defined things like common ground, that there are so many places where people speak of this region with the intent of debate, not dialogue, and those are different. And that participants sought to view this exhibition as common ground. That in embracing the complexity of the region, the museum should strive for balanced interpretation featuring perspectives from multiple religions and ethnicities. And in the pursuit of this balance, the museum needed to not avoid complexity. I want to put a little plug in there that balance and multiple perspectives is something that for museums for decades we've said, oh, but there's a panel. Non-erasure. By only using current terminology, we may inadvertently contribute to historical erasure. The exhibition should embrace the long lineage of identities associated with Jalame as a nation, as its people, and that the exhibition must do the past justice, and also how do we do the future justice within the exhibition itself. You can see the small panel of what the community advisors said and asked of folks over on the right-hand side, positioned in a strong position of power within the exhibition, but noticeably smaller than the other panels. You can see an example of how some of the conversation changed due to the input of the community advisors. Important to note that this was an exhibition that was designed for families and children. Thus the language of, how would you say this word, right? Within places that was then ultimately changed and augmented in regard to what the community wanted and said. And then also working for the inclusion of an artist by the name of Dima Saruji, who is a contemporary glass artist whose work was included at the end of the exhibition in order to continue to discuss issues of ownership within collections. After the events of October, it's important to know that this exhibition was still up. The museum did not call the community advisors back. The community advisors called the museum and said, hey, can we bring the gang back together again? It was a a moment of success for the institution in saying this is a community that found such great comfort in holding space and working together on the exhibition, that this was their instinct, was to say, I can't be in the conversations that are happening across the multiplicity of identities and communities, and instead that they wanted to be and hold space together. And they asked the museum very quickly, and at the museum's expense, to redo some panels. And many of the moments that you see, including an addendum to the community advisory panel, happened within weeks, right, of the events and stayed through. A note just in talking about the permanence of exhibits, the slow pace that I've heard mentioned, that we're moving, I just don't buy it. I think that as long as we are open to museums being a little bit messy, in terms of what we can fabricate and fabricate quickly, our exhibitions can turn things over in a much more expedient way, as emphasized by the Corning Museum of Glass. I'm going to leave it there so that we can hear some other examples and continue to work forward and find out why these worked or why other things have been challenging. Annie, I think you're here.
Despite Adam's wonderful breath movement that is supposed to center us, I have to say that being in this beautiful, spacious room is very difficult for me, someone who comes from the tenements and the constricted spaces. But seriously, it is such an honor to be here and to have a conversation about conversations and how difficult they are. I loved what Professor Sage Ward said earlier today about how do we make museums spaces that people can connect, and how do we make museum spaces for conversation. So rather than just thinking about what are the different hatreds we all need to think about and talk about, how can we, in moments like this, preserve space and create space for people to be coming together for different conversations. So the Tenement, I'll just give a little bit of background about the Tenement Museum and then kind of what we're trying to do to continuously push ourselves to create more space. So again, you're creating space at a place that was known for not having space. But this is the Tenement in 97 Orchard in 1988. And at that point, it had been, storefronts had kept it going, but the upper levels had been empty for several decades, for about 5 decades. And when the founders of the museum came upon it, they realized it was a time capsule. They realized it was a place that they could evoke the past. And at the very beginning, I think it was radical for 3 reasons. One is that they were telling stories about working class people. They were telling stories about people who never thought that they would be the subject matter of the museum. And once you do that, you really open up a lot of space for conversation. And they were doing this, of course, in contrast to the ways in which so many historic spaces tended to focus on the famous presidents, inventors, writers, and so on. They also, I think, were radical because they wanted to tell many different stories. So many museums, so many historic spaces tended to focus on one group or another, and there were many identity museums, and these are very, very important museums, but I think they intuited that a space like that had been in existence since 1863, since the middle of the Civil War, and housed people until 1935 and continued to welcome people in through their storefronts, that was a long history, and that because of that long history, you had many different waves of immigrants and migrants coming through, and that space could be a space to talk about multiple stories. And I think that created space too. And finally, and perhaps most important for today, they didn't get this initially or at the first day, but very soon, in the beginning of the museum's history, they came upon this idea that all experiences at the museum should be educator-led, that there should be groups of people looking at the stories together. They moved away from a concept of wall text. They moved away. They didn't know it at the time that there would be something called an acoustic guide, but that was not entertained. At the beginning, though, at the very beginning, they thought they were going to have actors in every room, which is a powerful way to tell history, costumed interpreters. And while we still have costumed interpreters, they understood another big element of museums, which is cost and that there's no money. And so the idea the idea of actors kind of, although we still have some marvelous costumed interpretation, but that can't be the only way you experience a museum. So because it's educator-led, again, there's space for, and Sarah mentioned this earlier, but what we call messy storytelling, right? That you're not in control of a narrative. We do not give our educators scripts. We give our educators about 50 pages of content that they complain about because there's no way you can say that in the course of an hour. But because when you do that, then you allow for conversations to go in many different directions based on who's in the room with you. So I think that set the stage early on for conversations. Oh, I have more pictures. This is the museum today. Still the same size. But now what we have are about a dozen different exhibits representing different families. All of our stories are of real families, people who really lived in not just 97 Orchard, but now 103 Orchard Street. And we're able to recreate those stories. And then, especially since the pandemic, paired the stories in different ways. So what happens when you tell an Italian story with a Jewish story together? And those families knew each other, and you can talk about the different relationships. So we've been mixing and matching the different stories in order to promote different conversations. And that's always been part of the history of the museum. However, what happens is things kind of got stuck, and you were making the same comparisons for a long time, and we've kind of moved that around. Here, again, you can see the timeline and just showing people more explicitly that there are so many stories to uncover. We welcome people into the homes of immigrants, migrants, and refugees and share their stories to connect past and present and also to build a more inclusive and expansive American society. And this, again, the trick of this is how do you bring people together in very narrow spaces and what literally was the most crowded neighborhood in the country, bring people of all different backgrounds in a space to tell history. Now, it's hard to see in this hallway, but on the left side you can see a rondel, a little mural. On the right side, you can just see that it's stark. That's the unrestored version on the right side. The museum did research and found out that those murals were painted around 1906, and that was important because it was right when gaslight was added. So when the gaslight was added, all of a sudden everyone could see hallways that had been dark for 40 years and were not pleasant to look at. So the landlord painted the hallways. But the murals, I think, were important because none of the murals had people in them. And up to now, we've been using those murals to ask people, what do you imagine the people who lived here thought when they looked at those murals? And up to now, people had said, well, I think they thought about where they had come from. If they were Irish, they thought about Ireland. If they were Italian, they thought about Italy. If they were Jewish, they thought about Russia or Poland. If they were German, they thought of Germany. And now, what's really interesting is to be able to use those same murals and think about what did Joseph and Rachel Moore, Black migrants, one who came from New Jersey, one who came from upstate New York, what did they think about? And they also thought about spaces that they had left behind, but the tenement has become more capacious to include their story. All of the tours are educator-led, allowing for conversation, a lot of work with objects. I mean, again, all of you know this in this room, but the ways in which people relate to objects just opens their minds for all sorts of conversations and questions. This is a more recent exhibit about the Epstein. One part of the apartment is the Epstein family, a family that the parents survived Auschwitz and Theresienstadt, met at a displaced persons camp, and then came to New York in 1947 and created a home for their two daughters who they raised here. Their story is told alongside the Saez Valdez story, a Puerto Rican story of a family that also lived in this building in the 1950s and 1960s. So the stories are told together. We recently did an evaluation project on this specific tour, And we were heartened, to find out that people built historical knowledge, that they connected past to present, that they built empathy, all the things that we were looking for. But in all of these surveys, or in all of these focus groups, what I most value are the verbatims, are just the quotes, what people said. And there was one where a woman who was Vietnamese said, "I learned about my family through this tour." And another one where the person said, "I've never been to a museum where the conversation was the exhibit." And I think that, again, is what gives us energy to keep going. But when you have a space like that, and this is, again, our plastic couch, which I'm not sure what I have to say about it other than this definitely creates spaces for people of all different cultures and all different backgrounds to connect and share stories. But when you're doing tours and you're promoting conversation, what that means is that you have to listen to the questions that come up on the tours. It's not just about go out and do this and have a nice time. It's what's coming up on tours. What are the difficult questions that we can't answer? And the best question, and not the best question, but an educator once said that her tour is never good unless there's a question that she cannot answer. And so there was a question that would come up when we were telling an Irish tour about a man named Joseph Moore and his wife Bridget Moore, who lived at 97 Orchard in 1869, 1870, and this was the city directory that we would pass out. So a city directory is like the 19th century version of the Yellow Pages, which we now also have to explain to a younger generation what the Yellow Pages are, so LinkedIn. But it basically was your name, where you lived, what your occupation was. And we were just simply passing it out to show that, look, Joseph P. Moore, he's a waiter, he lived here at 97 Orchard. We're not making up the story. But our visitors were smarter than us, and our visitors noticed that right above Joseph P. Moore, waiter, house 97 Orchard, was Joseph Moore, a parentheses, COL''D, waiter, house rear 17 Lawrence. And people asked us, who was this other Joseph Moore? What did COL''D stand for? We were able to answer that, say that was the 19th century term for people of African descent. And that raised a whole host of issues. Why didn't Joseph P. Moore have IRI next to his name? Why didn't other people have GER next to their name? Or why didn't other people have JEW next to their name? Only people of African descent were marked as separate in something as innocuous as a city directory. So from the beginning, that was pointing to the ways in which you could do a comparison, but it's also going to point out things that are different. What's different in immigrant history from Black history at the same time that you're looking at, what can you compare and how do we tell these stories? So we started to research Joseph Moore, and we would find out his wife's name was Rachel, and we found way more information about them than we did about Joseph P. Moore and his wife Bridget. So I always, when I'm giving the tour, I point out the other people on the tour on the opposite side of the wall, we know more about them here. And what we found was fascinating. They lived 17 Lawrence. How many of you are New Yorkers? And how many of you have heard of 17 Lawrence? How many of you have heard of West Broadway? Yes, okay, and even if you're not New York, it's right in the middle of Soho. And so we found his story and were able to tell this amazing story and decided to tell that story in our building, being very clear that they did not live in our building, but telling their story of what it would be like to be born right in the first few years after slavery has been abolished in New York. What was it like to be part of the largest free Black community in the North? What were the opportunities? What were the challenges? How did this compare to the other folks who lived in the building? And we didn't even, in their household, Joseph and Rachel Moore shared their home with an Irish woman named Rose Brown, who, like Rachel, was a laundress. And so you're telling a Black story and you're telling an Irish story, and it's not either or, but you're telling them in conversation with one another. And this is how we opened up conversation at the Tenement Museum. Alongside that, though, as much as we're opening up conversation on our tours through the content that we're telling, we also have to have the conversations internally about what's happening in our archive, what happened in our institution related to these themes. And what we found was very early on, in 1989, when the founder of the museum went on the radio on WNYC to talk about this crazy idea of a tenement museum, a Black woman named Gina Manuel, who was born in Harlem, wrote to her right away and talked about how this concept of a tenement museum opened up her mind. She heard the word, and you can see in that middle paragraph, tenements, tenements, tenements. She had this remarkable stories passed down to her by her great-grandmother and her grandmother, describing what life was like in the 1860s. How many of you can tell the stories of your great-great-grandparents 100 years before? But the storytelling was so rich, and this despite the fact that she never learned about this in school. This was passed down to her in her family, and she shared this information, and she ended her letter with a plea. So when you are planning the museum, I beg of you, please, please don't forget them. Their spirits walk those halls, and their bones lay in the earth there, and we remember them. Most of society seems to write us off when they look at the history of New York City and America, but my people were part of New York City long before it was a city as such. And so this was something that we looked at as well in our own archives. How did we forget it? Because I had worked at the museum for over a decade before I saw this letter. And so we've made this part of the tour. This is part of the conversation with our visitors, not just looking at the history, but looking at what history has been told and what history hasn't been told, and what do we do with that. And there are many more stories that we try to bring in conversation. These are stories that we've collected, your story, our story, with 14,000 stories. And just to point out one connection, the first two, this is if you type in refugee, this is what comes up. All different cultures finding spaces to connect. The girl at the top left, the blanket that she has was given to her, or was passed down to her. She never met her great-grandmother, who was a Holocaust survivor from Hungary. And then right next to her is a woman who came in 2022 from Ukraine with a bracelet. And so again, how do we use our museums to connect across space, across time? And then how do we use our museums to continue to have conversations to understand who we are and where we are? And those conversations continue. I'll just end with one thing I'm puzzling with and thinking over. I read an article in The Atlantic yesterday by Franklin Foer about anti-Semitism in America since October 7th, but talking about a golden age of kind of American Jewish life in the 20th century, and how that rested on a distinct strain of liberalism, I'm quoting now, that combined robust civil liberties, the protection of minority rights, and an ethos of cultural pluralism, and that all of this depended and validated and upheld the importance of tolerance, fairness, and cosmopolitanism. And there's no question in my mind that everything the Tenement Museum does rests on those ideas, but the importance of continuing to use those values to expand and create more space for more and more conversation. And so one of the things I'm thinking about is, what do we do as a museum to make sure that this democratic view, this democratic space, the complexities, the ambiguities is truly making as much space as possible for as many people to think about history and to think about how we've told history. So, and then thank you.
Hello again, so beautiful. You should know that Annie and I rode the same school bus to the same Orthodox Jewish day school in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So just super excited to be here with everyone. I'm taking off my Pittsburgh Ballet Theater hat, and I'm putting on a different hat as the co-founder of DNA Works, which is an arts and service organization committed to healing through the arts and dialogue. As a young person, I inherently knew that I needed to use genealogical research to reclaim ancestral memories in hopes of reconnecting me and my family to the past. Since then, this journey, which has been one of healing both racism and anti-Semitism, has been an act of reparative justice and holism, of tikkun olam, of recovering shards of memories and creating opportunities to put them back together again. And like this Ghanaian Sankofa symbol, the Adinkra West African symbol of a bird looking back and moving forward, I have invited others too in this quest as the ancestors instruct us to go back and get it. And by it, I think the ancestors mean history, certainly, but I also think they mean you. And I think they mean me. And I think they mean us together. I'm a dancer, and I use dance and movement as the lens through which to peer back to history. These are all people in my family. To make sense of the past and to better understand the manner in which we operate now. I look back to, and I draw upon and lean into the practice of text-based analysis that I learned at the Orthodox Jewish Day School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in Chumash and Mishnah and other books, and mapping. These are my parents in 1962, to inform my artistic research. And through text and map-based research, I located my great-grandparents' formerly sharecropped land in Forest City, Arkansas. And of course, on that land, I used my body as a map to reclaim Black land and embodied Black memories associated with that land. And in pursuit of land, I found people. I reconnected with my family after more than a century of disconnection. My master's research looked at the physical effects and manifestations of racism. What does racism do to our bodies in particular, on individual levels, on collective levels, and the use of dance as a healing catalyst. When I moved to Texas in 2016, I began to research racism and soon learned about the racial terror lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse, who was a butcher at the Swift & Company meatpacking plant, who was attacked during a union strike, right where the large group of people is at the end of the stairs. He was stabbed and left for dead. He was taken to the hospital and was abducted from that hospital and taken to the death tree where he was murdered. And he is buried in New Trinity Cemetery near Fort Worth, Texas. And when I delved deeper into the story of Mr. Fred Rouse, I soon learned that Fort Worth, Texas had one of the largest Klan memberships in the United States in the 1920s. So much so that they built a building as the headquarters of the Klan in Texas in 1925. And because I could locate no images of Mr. Fred Rouse, I went back to my body and used my body to remember him. And in each of the locations associated with the racial terror lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse, I took photographs of me in tintype so as to conflate a century. Here at the site of the racial terror lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse, and here in New Trinity Cemetery. Together with a group of community members, we created an organization to remember Mr. Fred Rouse, Tarrant County Coalition for Peace and Justice, a community remembrance project of the Equal Justice Initiative. And my colleagues here so beautifully have discussed the importance of object. This object here is a jar of soil that was extracted from the site of the racial terror lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse. One jar is in Fort Worth, and the other is at the Legacy Museum from enslavement to mass incarceration. And as I began to map these locations associated with the racial terror lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse, and because everyone who answered the question with a no, and the question was, have you heard of the racial terror lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse? I decided that it made sense to take people on a tour of the locations. And like the Sankofa, we went in reverse order so as not to re-perform the order of events on Mr. Fred Rouse. We went in reverse, kind of uncoiling memory and time. And I took people on bikes so that we could use our bodies to remember too, to slow down. And here's a group of people at the former city and county hospital from where Mr. Fred Rouse was abducted. And here outside of the former headquarters of the KKK building. It's important to mention that we hired Black mental health counselors for this work to ensure that people felt safe and supported, and invited people to tell their own stories connected to some of the elements in the story of Mr. Fred Rouse. From an artistic perspective, we also built an augmented reality application app. You can find it on the App Store and Google Play. If you search for FWLT, it'll come up. And you can map the locations, access historical documentation, listen to first-person narratives, and using gaming technology, swipe away the throng of protesters at the stockyards to allow Mr. Fred Rouse to walk home. And of course, in the search for land, this is at the 100th year after the racial terror lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse, we dug up the soil and connected with Mr. Fred Rouse's family. These are 3 of his grandchildren, some great-grandchildren and cousins, none of whom learned about how their grandfather died previous to this event, weeks before the event. And it was super important to include them in this process. This is Mr. Fred Rouse III. We mapped the locations with historical markers and invited the family to design the Mr. Fred Rouse Memorial. So we purchased the site of the racial terror lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse, and we're turning it into a memorial site designed by the family. Some of the artwork was used in an art exhibit called Shelter in Place as part of Dwelling in a Time of Plague. Shout out to Lou Cove, who's here, and to Judy Margles, formerly of Ojemchi. And Shelter in Place was created during COVID. I was in Texas, this is in Portland. And we used the windows as a way for community members to access art during COVID. And in later iterations, included augmented reality technology. You can see here image mapping. Sorry, can we go back a little bit? There's image mapping that I'll share with you another time. And lastly, we organized a group of 8 arts organizations to purchase the former Klan Hall. And in 2026, We will be opening the Fred Rouse Center for Arts and Community Healing. It's an international site of conscience. And the process too, in terms of the design, in terms of the programming, is all community-centered, and I can't wait to share with you both the success around the work and all of the challenges that you can imagine that come up with choosing to talk about racism and heal racism. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for doing your homework. So this first question, I actually think each of you could answer, but maybe a little bit more Annie, who's working specifically at a museum. The question is asking about how leadership is working, how you all work with board members or donors or stakeholders to be able to tell the honest history. And when and does it cause conflict with anyone with some sort of financial power or influence, and sort of how do you resolve that?
Honestly, I have to say there has never been a content issue we've had where we've had any kind of resistance from board members. So the flip side of that is that we need more money. The financial issues are always present, but we haven't, I can't think of something where we've wanted to do something or thought where we've had resistance.
Sarah, yeah.
Just two initial thoughts with that. One is to cite a colleague of many of ours, Sean Kelly, who I know has been active with CAJM for a very long time. And Sean and I talk a lot about the 1s to 5s of any given issue. And that there are folks who, in his case, if he is talking about mass incarceration, are at a 1, right? And some who are at a 5, right? And, you know, at Eastern State, where he used to work, that meant like those were the folks who just wanted to see Al Capone sell, right? And I think what we don't often think about is that our boards are structured that way as well, around a variety of kind of issues and exposure and viewpoints and bias. And that, you know, Sean and I talk openly about the idea that we always program for the 5s, or we're concerned about the 5s, and we're concerned about the 1s. And when I think about working with boards, one of the best advice I was given in that context is to say, don't be worried about your 5s, the board member who is challenged by the work that's happening. Let your 1s talk to your 2s, and your 2s talk to your 3s, and your 3s talk to your 4s, and your 4s talk to your 5s. And that ethos is a big part of how dialogue works as well, right? We think about dialogue as ineffective for the 5s. And whenever I hear people talk about, I don't want to talk anymore, and I don't want to have conversations, it's because we're centering the 5s and the challenges that we are perceiving in the conversation, rather than thinking about the building energy that dialogue and conversations are built to capture the 2s and the 3s and the 4s. So I offer that in terms of thinking about boards. The other thing that I would think about, which is something that I learned at the Tenement Museum originally, was to say that all too often our boards just aren't involved to the degree that we need them to be in the day-to-day things that are happening. And so, you know, when I am asked to go in and do dialogic work with any institution, it's not a rider in my contract at this point, but it is something that I explicitly talk about, which is how many of your board members are going to be there. Can you assure me your executive director is going to sit in the space with their teams the entire day and not go out and take phone calls? Right? And what the makeups of all of the actual work is, because we all too often are doing the work with our educators, sometimes with our curators, and not with the other folks, right, who need to be on the same page about that work.
Yeah, and this isn't, I agree 100%, and this isn't exactly about boards, but I think and I've seen this more in the last few years, if you think about that, like that timeline that I showed that shows all the different immigrant groups that and migrant groups that we talk about the Tenement Museum, where I have seen resistance is if one group mistakenly thinks that because another group is added, their story isn't going to be told, right? So that there's this idea that can we really, just a fear almost that their story isn't going to be told just because another story is added. And so that's not a either or, it's just a matter of, I think a larger fear out there that people are worried that their stories aren't going to be told.
And I think sort of gathering these, it's about maybe active listening and thinking about where people are coming from and how to respond. And Adam, I'm not sure if you had any moments of this, like dealing with like the city of Fort Worth and like creating a public memorial and space. Was there any pushback, and how did you deal with that?
Of course. It's hard to remember. And my question is, when has forgetting ever helped anything? And some of us who are Jewish understand lizchor, that it's up to us to remember. And I think when we have a full and holistic understanding of history and including everyone's story, and understanding the manner in which it affects our current existence, we're able to then respond more specifically and in more nuanced ways. But if we don't have all of the information, the actions, the results aren't as accurate. And so, we're receiving a lot of pushback, mainly from older Black people and communities. And I just wonder about the generational access to feeling or the responsibilities therein. But yeah, it's certainly a balancing act.
And just our last question, and sort of open this up, what or how do we tell these stories, and how do we leverage storytelling if we are working at an institution or in an organization that does not have a collection, either an oral history or object-based collection? And we saw a little bit about like an AR app or inviting the community to give more objects, but is there any other advice you guys would give to the audience?
I think stories, someone said earlier, it's not, objects are gateways to stories, collections are gateways to stories. So I think however you can summon the storytelling power of your institution and you're genuine and you're kind of authentic to that space and the ideas and the mission behind, that's the most important thing, the stories that connect people.
The thing I wrote down actually just came from your visitor at the museum to say that this was the first place they felt that the conversation was the exhibition. And I think that sometimes we get so caught up in what an object will tell us or what an oral history says that we forget that that there is an opportunity for the space in between those things. And in that space is our visitors' stories, the visitors' conversation, and the new narratives that develop through those conversations and lenses. So I would lean into what if the conversation itself was your content.
Agreed. Super beautiful. I also think that we shouldn't underestimate the power and importance of people coming together, because what we know about histories of oppression has been isolation. And it's important and possible and natural for people to convene and share stories and share experiences and share spaces and to notice our bodies in those spaces as being as important as anything else.
I love that we had questions, and I invite everyone to continue to meditate on this and really think about the intention we each have to create spaces for these conversations. I know this was an inspiring panel, and I know we're going to continue to have great talks and learning opportunities. So as a way to move us into the next session, I'm going to hand it over to Adam to close us out.
Okay, how much time do we have? 0 minutes? All right. Got it. Great. So we're going to create a little movement phrase. I'm going to lean into my relationships here. So can you just make some sort of circular action or movement? Some sort of, just Jordanna, just something circular. Something circular. Okay, great. That's a circular. And can you create something circular too? Yeah, something circular. Okay, awesome. And she's just making something circular. That's great. Yep, really good. And mine is, making this circle. Okay, and Annie Polland's going to do a circular something. Sorry to put you on display. Okay, great. So the movement phrase that we create is let's have panelists just make a circle around your body. We're going to do Jordanna's action. Yep, and then Sarah's action. And then my action. And then Annie's action. One more time, Jordanna, Sarah, Adam, Annie. You could do this sitting down too if you want to. Jordanna. That one's kind of hard. Sarah, Adam. You can do this in your seats. Annie. Let's do this for Jordanna. That's a circle. Sarah, Adam, Annie. One more time, and Jordanna. And last time. Let's just take an inhale